Hey there, advanced procrastinators. Welcome back. We are doing a review of Study Guide Chapter 8 from Fast Track to a 5 on the Civil War. Now, you should have already answered these questions before we began about the Civil War. And in today's lecture, as we're answering it, guys, make sure you answer the green questions as we're going through. So have that Google Doc open so you can do that as we go. And let's get into it. Now, we're looking at the Civil War, and given that the Civil War split the country into two nations, students are going to examine the causes of the Civil War, identify and explain the importance of two major battles at least, discuss how the issue of slavery helped the North re-examine the reason why they're fighting the war, and number 4, analyze two ways the Civil War changed the Union. Basically, it's a Civil War that there's a before the United States and Civil War and after the United States and Civil War. And it's not just because of the issue of slavery, there's other issues. Now, about the issue of slavery. What was it about slavery that Northerners were most opposed to? Now, keep this in mind about slavery. Slavery was known as a peculiar institution because it was only in the South. In the upper right-hand corner map, you can see it's in the southern Atlantic coastal states. In the lower map by 1860, you can see it's basically in just the region that's known as the South. Okay, if it's in green, there's no slavery. And what Americans are most against is the expansion of slavery into the West. You can see from the map above that when America became a nation and the Constitution was being written, the issue of slavery in the West didn't matter because we didn't own any land in the West. But now, with the war against Mexico and having acquired land from Mexico, as well as Oregon and Texas, there's a big issue of what's going to happen to these areas in the West. And a reason why Americans are against slavery in the West is not so much racism, it was whites did not want competition of labor with blacks. Why would people why might people want to hire black people over white people? I mean, if you think about it, if America has levels of racism, wouldn't people be in more favor of hiring white people over black people? Why would white people be afraid of black competition? Stop and think about that. And the answer is, just as is there another group whites disapprove of for the same reason, it's the fear that blacks would work for less money, especially if they're slaves. They could be hired out by a slave owner for less money than a white working gang because you don't have to pay slaves anything. This was the same thing with the Irish, that Americans were angry at the Irish because they came to America and they were willing to work for less money. Now, some of the events are going to lead to the Civil War. Now, the first event that doesn't lead to it, but it is a stepping stone of the process of slavery in the West, and that is the Missouri Compromise. In the map in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that there is a line that says called 3630, right? And it says no slavery in the Louisiana Territory above 3630. Now, the purpose of this compromise was that Missouri wanted to become a state. And in order for it to become a state, it had enough population. A issue was that there was equal amount of slave states and free states. And the fear is in the Senate, if there was more free states than slave states, the Senate could vote to ban slavery because the House of Representatives is based on population, and there are already more people living in the North. So in the House of Representatives, there was more Northern representation that could ban slavery. But in the South, as long as the Senate was equal representation, the South had power to save slavery. So Missouri is admitted as a free slave state, and Maine is going to be admitted as a free state. So there's balance in the Senate. But the other agreement was this issue of 3630, which in the purple area in the map in the upper left-hand corner, no slavery would ever be there. So it was designed to keep slavery in the South, and all the South got out of it was the Arkansas Territory, a small little piece of territory. Now, the South basically agreed to this because they kind of knew, we all knew in America, that America was going to go to war with Mexico one day, and that whole area known as Spanish Mexico is going to be part of the United States one day. And the South was figuring that that area, which is essentially in the South, would be given to the South. And you'd have kind of an equanimity between the northern states in blue, purple, and green, and the southern states in red, orange, and the Spanish territory. Now, after the Mexican-American War, now we have the map in the upper right-hand corner, and there's new land in the West. And gold's discovered in California. And California overnight has enough population to apply for statehood. So the issue is about whether to allow slavery into areas acquired from Mexico. So in this compromise, what comes out of the compromise? Well, California enters the Union as a free state. Now the North gets an extra 2 senators, so that's what the North gets. The South, they get in return something called the Fugitive Slave Law, in which the North forces Northerners to return runaway slaves. Now, this is a compromise, and the problem with compromises is compromises never appeal to everyone, or everyone's unhappy with something in it. Now, how does it upset both the South and the North? And the answer to this is, for the South, they're upset because now the North has more power in the Senate. There's one extra free state, which means two extra senators in the North. And for the North, they're upset because they're forced to go against their beliefs if they're anti slavery. Remember, we just learned about the Second Great Awakening. A lot of Americans found Jesus. And the idea is, how many slaves would Jesus own? Well, now if I'm a person who's found God, I'm being forced to return a runaway slave, or I could be jailed or fined for not helping to get a runaway slave when that's against my religious beliefs. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Right. What the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is, in the upper left-hand corner, that's the compromise of 1850. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act repeals the Missouri Compromise, meaning it allows slavery in the unorganized territory, or the Louisiana Territory, above 3630. And you can see the difference between the map on the left, where the unorganized territory in the center of the country is green, and the map on the right, where all of a sudden it's become orange. And this Kansas-Nebraska Act, when it repeals the Missouri Compromise, upsets Northerners incredibly. Why are Americans upset with the repeal of the Missouri Compromise? And the answer to it is, remember that Americans are most against the expansion of slavery. It's not so much the issue of slavery they want to ban, they don't want it to expand. And what's just happened is slavery is now expanded to an area it never once existed. And now there's a fear it could expand into Oregon or Minnesota or other states as well, too. And what we get out of it is bleeding Kansas. This is a mini civil war over the issue of slavery in Kansas, right? It's between free soilers and the pro-slavery forces, right? Now, what happens in Kansas is this, is that in the map on the upper right, it was figured that Nebraska territory would be turned into free territory because you can't grow cotton there. So that would be a free state. But Kansas, the hope would be for the South, it would be a slave state. So, but the North was afraid that whatever happened in Kansas would happen to the whole West. So the idea was popular sovereignty, to let the people of Kansas vote on if they want to have slavery or not. Sounds like a good idea. Now, is having people vote, having direct democracy on the issue of slavery, a sensible solution in regards to slavery's existence in Kansas? Or can you think of this? If Kansas is going to vote on slavery, is one side going to have an advantage in voting? And the answer is, actually, in this case, the problem here is voting might not have been the right solution here. This is such a powerful emotional issue for a lot of people, that both sides want to do everything they could to win in Kansas, right? The problem here with Kansas is that the pro-slavery forces cheated in the election, because it was very easy for pro-slavery forces to cross over the border from Missouri into Kansas. So Kansas becomes a slave territory. And bleeding Kansas, when Americans start killing each other in Kansas, is a result of this disputed election. Now, Dred Scott. The issue of Dred Scott is the idea of can you take a slave to a free state? And Dred Scott sues, saying that his master took him to a free state for 5 years and that he should be free. Well, in the Supreme Court decision that happens, the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court declares that slaves are property. That means it's legal to take your slavery in all Western territories. You essentially can't ban slavery, because if you have property, you can take your property anywhere you want. Just because you cross a state line doesn't make it your property anymore. In fact, the Supreme Court goes even further, because they want to solve the issue of slavery and ensure slavery is protected, because 7 Supreme Court justices were Southerners. And they said that slaves are not citizens. In fact, it implies that Africans, in the court decision, said they are not American and they have no place in the United States except as slaves. Now, this is another issue to keep in mind about the North being furious over this decision. Think, the Civil War is not just Southerners fighting to keep slavery. There's a lot of Northerners are very upset at the actions that the South takes here, right? And why are Northerners so furious over the decision about Dred Scott, about the fact that a free slave, right, can be taken anywhere in America? And the answer is, for this, is number one, what are Northerners most against? The expansion of slavery. And basically, you've expanded slavery everywhere in the United States. Another issue about the fact that African Americans are not American and have no place in the U.S. except as slaves is meant to prevent the debate about freeing slaves. Because now, if you end slavery in America, they're not citizens of the United States. They're like undocumented people. because they're not immigrants, they're from the United States. And what are you supposed to do? Send them all back to Africa? So it was to try to make the abolitionist debate to end slavery even more difficult to achieve. Now, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, these are debates where Lincoln is running for the Senate seat from Illinois, not for the presidency. It's in 1858 as a Republican. And the Republican Party is a nascent or a new political party that is founded as an anti-slavery party in the United States. So in these debates, Lincoln is arguing that slavery, right, should not have a place in America. Lincoln believes blacks should have the equality of opportunity. He's not arguing for equality of blacks. He just says slavery should end so that every person can go as far as their talent can take them, which is the Declaration of Independence. He even has his famous House Divided speech saying a split country cannot survive. Now, in this election against Stephen Douglas, who is the most powerful senator in the United States in Illinois, Lincoln loses the election. Douglas is reelected into the Senate. But why is this election significant for Republicans and for Lincoln, even though he's a loser? Think. And the answer is Republicans, who are a brand new political party, are looking for a candidate that they think could win the war. And all of a sudden, it looks like Lincoln could be that presidential candidate that could help the Republicans win the next election in 1860. Now, before that election, Harpers Ferry occurs. And Harpers Ferry is an armory where the federal government keeps its guns. And the idea is that John Brown was going to raid the armory and he's going to give guns to slaves. So this is basically a failed slave revolt led by a white person. Now, the South blames Harpers Ferry on the Republican Party for leading the raid. Now, the Republican Party had nothing to do with it, but the South's point of view is, hey, if John Brown voted, he'd vote Republicans. And the South will secede if the Republicans or Lincoln wins the presidency. Well, guess what happens? In the election of 1860, Lincoln wins the presidency by winning only the northern states. You can see in the map in the upper right-hand corner, everything in green is Lincoln. So that means the whole South voted against Lincoln, and the South still lost. So is the South right to think this way, that Lincoln and the Republicans becoming presidency means that their way of life is going to end and they have a good reason to secede? And the answer is yeah. If you're a Southerner, they are thinking the right way. The problem that they're thinking is, number one, you have border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. They're slave states that don't need slavery. And the fear here is that the federal government will say, hey, we'll build you a railroad if you get rid of slavery. Well, if we don't need slavery, sure, I'll take a free railroad. Also, if you see in that map, all that brown part is going to be free new states, and those new states are probably going to be free states. In order to get a constitutional amendment passed, you need 3/4 of the states to agree, and it looks like in a short amount of time, when those territories become states, the North will have the votes to get a new amendment. And are there any more John Browns out there? Are there any more people who are copycat criminals that might want to do the same thing? So the South's thinking the only way we can protect ourselves is to secede and start our own nation, the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America. Okay, so secession is the only way to protect slavery and their life. So the Civil War breaks out. Fort Sumter are the first shots fired. This is when the lower South secedes first. South Carolina secedes in December, and then Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana. They then declare independence in January, all before Lincoln becomes president of the United States. But some states like Virginia haven't decided to join the South yet. At Fort Sumter, which is a Union fort that's in South Carolina after it's seceded, Fort Sumter is attacked by Confederate troops. The Union troops give up. And at this moment, this is when Virginia decides to secede, knowing that there's not going to be a compromise, there's going to be war. One of the most important battles of the war is going to be Antietam. Those are images of Antietam, and Antietam is the bloodiest day of the war. There are 20,000 casualties in one day. And this is actually 2 years into the war, really the first big Union victory that the North has had. For the first 2 years, the South is winning this war. And because of Antietam and the Union winning, it looks like maybe the North might win this war. It was unsure about 2 years in. So Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is the first time the government says it's going to try to do something to end slavery. Lincoln says, All states, all slaves in states that are or areas of rebellion are now free. Now think about this. Lincoln has issued all slaves in areas of rebellion free. How many slaves is free? And why is the Emancipation Proclamation, how does it change the nature of this war? And the answer is, it does not free a single slave. Remember, the areas of rebellion are another country. So he's basically freed slaves that are in another country. And also, areas of slave areas that are not in rebellion, the border states, they still get to keep their slaves. So then why is it important if he's issued a proclamation that doesn't free a single slave? Because basically he says when the war ends, we're not going to have slavery anymore. Lincoln has just changed the war from a war to just save the United States and get the South back into the North, which was the original purpose of the war, to a war for freedom, which is what it should have been in the beginning. Now, Gettysburg is the largest battle of the war. At this battle, the South loses 30,000 troops, the North loses 23,000 troops. The Battle of Vicksburg, in the map on the lower right, you can see where the two blue arrows meet each other in between Arkansas and Louisiana there. It splits the South in half, and the Union takes control of the Mississippi River. Now, these two battles are important because it basically means the South is now for sure going to lose the war. They don't give up until another 7 or 8 months, but it basically means they're going to lose this war. And why? The answer is, for number one, the South loses 30,000 troops, the North loses 23,000 troops. But for the South, they have fewer soldiers and a smaller population. So the South or Lee's troops are never going to be as strong as ever again. Also, with Vicksburg, the South's now cut in half. Texas is now out of the war, and the North controls transportation of the Mississippi River. And a big part of this war is movement of troops and goods around the area. So it's going to allow the North to get deep into the South with troops, supplies, and food and things that they need in order to control the South. At Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, General Lee surrenders to General Grant, and basically it is a very, very amicable surrender. That Grant allows the South to go home and begin planting because it's April, it's planting season, and there was no harsh surrender terms. So, two key transformations that occur because of the Civil War. How does it change the nature of this country? Well, number one is this: there's a contract theory and a compact theory of how the states are going to be together. Now, contract theory says we've written into a contract, okay, and if you break the contract, we can leave. And that's what the South said. Our contract said we could have slavery. You're breaking slavery. We're going to leave. The compact theory now says no. Our nation's called the United States of America. We are one nation forever, not a collection of states. It's like your family. Once you're a member of family, no matter if you like them or hate them or whoever it is, you're still family no matter what happens, okay? And because of this, it gives more power to the federal government. A second thing is the North has to make everything for the war. And the North transforms during this with factories. And it is going to be this war that's going to change America from becoming a farming nation to an industrialized nation. And by 40 years later, 1900, the United States is the largest manufacturing nation in the world. Now, another extraordinary thing at the end of the war is that the election of 1864 for the presidency was held. Never in the history of the world had there ever been an election in which a nation was in a civil war where the nation's fighting itself, and half the nation wasn't there to vote. Okay. Now, the reason why this was held is because Lincoln wanted the election to be a referendum on slavery. Lincoln felt that winning meant Americans wanted to end slavery or the 13th Amendment. Now, analyze, why do you think Lincoln felt it was so necessary to have Americans reelect them as president in order to show support for the 13th Amendment? And the answer to this is, remember, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and there's the answer. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln wrote an executive order to end slavery in the United States, and he felt that having one person declare slavery ended in America doesn't have the power of having the people vote knowing that that person then is going to elect. So by reelecting Lincoln, he knew that gave him the power to pass the 13th Amendment, which actually ended slavery in the United States. And that's the reason why the election happened. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Have a good day, and I will talk to you guys soon.